Hi, this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog UN Dispatch. Pleased to be speaking again today with Kristele Younes from Refugees International. Hello, Kristele.
Hi, Mark.
So last time we spoke, you had recently returned from Afghanistan, and now you have recently returned from Iraq. So we're going to be talking today about the sort of Iraq refugee crisis. I presume you're probably also in Jordan and Syria, and I think this is a critically important story, probably one of the more overlooked stories of the Iraq situation is the plight of the refugees that have fled the fighting there. So I'm very happy to be talking to you today.
Thank you, Mark.
I guess first things first, sort of where were you and when were you there and sort of what did you see?
I was actually in Syria and Lebanon this time, focusing on the situation of Iraqi refugees there, and I was there throughout, from mid-September to about mid-October. I came back a week ago. And what I did see is that the number of refugees, of course, remains very, very high, and their situation is getting worse as time goes by. Most of these people's resources are now depleted, and they are facing extreme challenges, especially in a situation where food prices have gone up, where fuel prices have gone up, and where, in general, the economy in the Middle East is not doing very well. And the first ones to suffer from this, of course, are the most vulnerable, and they are the refugees from Iraq.
And how many refugees are we talking about that have fled the Iraq fighting?
I think it's very difficult to say for sure how many, because this is an urban crisis where most people live in Damascus, Beirut, or other cities, and it's very difficult to count exactly the numbers of people. According to the UN, we are now looking at about 2 million people who have sought refuge outside Iraq, and there's about probably 1.2 to 1.5 million of those who are in Syria alone.
So the majority are in Syria. I've heard also that Jordan is also a large receiving country for Iraq refugees. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's the second largest refugee population in the Middle East is in Jordan.
Now, have there been camps or temporary sites set up to handle this influx of refugees, or are most of them living with relatives or friends or in boarding houses in the cities that you described in Damascus and in Beirut?
When it comes to Iraqi refugees from Iraq, most of them live in urban environments. They rent apartments or they're staying with friends or relatives, which makes it very hard to reach out to them and to identify them. They look the same as the host populations. They speak the same language. It's very hard for aid organizations to really be able to reach out to them. There are some camps that are set at the border between Syria and Iraq, but those are for the Palestinians from Iraq who had to flee Iraq because of being persecuted after 2003. These people are stateless, and because they're stateless, they haven't been allowed into Syria. They live in desperate conditions, in makeshift tents, on the border, as I mentioned, in a desert-like context, and they need immediate resettlement to Western countries.
So there are a number of Palestinian refugees, you said, that are living in camps. How many are there?
We're looking right now between the two camps on the Syrian border and right on the Iraqi side of the Syrian border. We're looking at about 3,000 people. 3,000.
And these presumably are Palestinians who fled sort of Israel in 1948 and were accepted in Iraq and are now facing persecution in Iraq?
Exactly. These people are stateless. They were relatively well treated under the Saddam Hussein government. They had particular rights, etc., but they were never nationalized. They never were given a passport. And as a result of that, these people are not able to go anywhere at the moment, and they are extremely vulnerable.
And were they specifically targeted in sort of the sectarian violence that had sort of racked Iraq in sort of following the invasion?
They were. Most people don't like them because there is this impression that they were loyal to Saddam Hussein, which is not necessarily true at all. Also, a lot of Shia feel resentment because they felt that the Palestinians were favored under the Saddam Hussein's government. So these people have been attacked in 2003 by a variety of different groups and militias and have not been protected at all by the Iraqi government. Indeed, their situation is amongst the most vulnerable inside Iraq, and they're not Iraqis. They're not holders of Iraqi passports, so they can't even seek refuge in neighboring countries.
And the only hope you think is for Western countries to step up and start accepting them?
Yes, they need to be
refugees?
resettled immediately. These people there's no other solution for them for the moment. They need to be resettled, and they need to be provided with a path to citizenship. It's not enough to move them around. These people have been stateless for 60 years now, and they need to have durable solutions applied to them. The only country that has stepped up and sort of volunteered to receive a large number of them is Sudan, which is ironic for many reasons. We certainly oppose this move, first of all, because Sudan is not particularly stable, and we don't want these people to be sent to another unstable country yet again. But second, because this resettlement to Sudan would not involve a path to citizenship and would not involve durable solutions for Palestinians. We need these people to be resettled in traditional resettlement countries like the United States, like Canada, like Australia, or others, and be provided with nationality after a while.
And so far, there have been no offers at all.
Very
Is
few.
that right?
Some countries have stepped up and taken a couple of dozens. Chile, Brazil, Sweden has offered, I believe, but most countries have not expressed any interest.
That's pretty ridiculous. I mean, we're only talking about 3,000 people, correct?
Yes, you are potentially talking about more because there's still a community left in Baghdad, but overall you're not talking about more than 15,000 people, and this should be a clear-cut situation. However, because of the particular sensitivities linked to the fact that they are Palestinians, this has been taken forever to get people to even start talking about it and paying attention to it. But I agree with you, it's ridiculous. It's a humanitarian tragedy, and people should step up immediately to the plate. It's absolutely shameful that we've been letting those people live in those conditions for so long.
I guess turning back to sort of the majority of Iraqi refugees you say are living in cities now, in places like Beirut and Damascus. I'm wondering, sort of, presumably when you have that great an influx of people coming into a city, sort of the demographics and the economy of these cities change. And has that been the case in places like Damascus?
It has, of course. I mean, you are talking about 1 million plus refugees in a country that is not particularly rich and is not doing particularly well from an economic perspective. Syria is currently going through the worst drought it's known in the past 40 years. Food prices in general are rising throughout the globe, but because of this drought, they've risen particularly in Syria. The Syrian economy is a socialist economy. Most of the items are subsidized. The cost of subsidizing these items for an extra 1 million people has been quite high. The Syrians have been very generous in opening up their public schools, their hospitals, etc. to Iraqi refugees. But again, all this is subsidized, so it's costing quite a lot of money to the Syrian state. And they've received very little assistance from the international community. Yes, the United Nations are there. Yes, they're trying to provide assistance to the most vulnerable. But this assistance is very minimal compared to what the Syrians are really handling. And yet they've received no bilateral support from the international community in general.
So, I mean, that's it. I guess it would come as something of a shock to sort of make people, an American audience perhaps, accustomed to thinking of Syria as the bad guy. But in fact, you say they've been generous and they've opened up their hospitals and schools to Iraqi refugees. I'm wondering, though, is there a sense, having traveled to Damascus, that Syrians are there's a limit perhaps to the Syrian generosity, that there's an expectation that in the near future the Iraqi refugees will go home?
I think that's for sure. I believe the Syrians will very soon sort of reach the end of the rope. As I mentioned, they are in very difficult economic conditions right now, and they are extremely frustrated with the lack of support. The only time we mention Syria when talking about Iraq is to mention, the sort of bad political role it's allegedly playing. I think, there needs to be recognition over the fact that they are playing a very significant positive role in the humanitarian front. Syria has already started taking measures to sort of limit the number of Iraqis inside the country. As of last year, it started a visa program where people can no longer come into Syria without receiving a visa at the border and pay fees for this visa. Iraqis are supposed to go back to Iraq every 3 months to renew this visa. Most people don't do it because they can't afford to, but also because it's too dangerous for them to do it. But nobody really knows for sure how long it's going to take the Syrians to say, okay, enough is enough. I think in general there's quite a bit of pressure on Iraqis inside Syria to return to Iraq. from the Syrian government, but also very much from the Iraqi government, who's behaving in an incredibly irresponsible way in this entire situation. Not only is it not providing Syria with any real assistance to deal with Iraqi refugees when Iraq itself is sitting on billions of dollars of unspent money, but it's also very much pressuring its own population to return, saying that the conditions are met. The conditions are not met. Not only is Iraq not safe enough, but also most Iraqis don't have access to essential services. Most of those who have returned have found that their houses occupied and have not been able to return to their initial neighborhood. Do we really want to create a generation of Iraqis that's going to be internally displaced? Do we really want to, enhance the Balkanization inside Iraq? No, it's not a good idea, both from a humanitarian but also from a security perspective. So the international community really has to step up and increase its assistance to refugees in their countries of asylum and to those countries of asylum to encourage them to keep that space, that asylum space, open for as long as possible.
Does that risk, I guess, having sort of a permanent population of Iraqis living in Syria, though?
I think whatever happens, and we certainly do hope that most Iraqis will eventually be able to go back to Iraq, but whatever happens, there will be some Iraqis who will not be able to return. Like in any major refugee crisis, some people will not be able to return, either because they're too vulnerable, they don't have the means to rebuild their lives inside Iraq, or because they've been targeted in particular ways and won't receive proper protection upon return. I'm thinking in particular of religious minorities, for example, Christians or Mandaeans, who have been, wiped out of many cities of Iraq and who might never be able to return, depending on what the political situation is inside Iraq. I'm also thinking about former members of the Ba'ath Party or the Saddam Hussein's army who have been targeted as such and labeled as such and who might never be able to return, or those who have worked for the U.S. and who have been again labeled as such and won't be able to return safely. These people will most likely need a permanent haven, and unfortunately Western countries like the US are not willing to resettle very large numbers of Iraqis. So for those who won't be resettled and who won't be able to return to Iraq, solutions must be found in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in other countries of the Middle East.
Actually, can we talk a little bit about Lebanon? Because that's not, at least when you think about sort of the Iraq refugee crisis, I never considered or even thought that Lebanon would be a destination, Beirut would be a destination city. Are the conditions in Beirut different from that in Damascus?
The conditions are quite different in that in Lebanon, many Iraqis are actually arrested and detained for being there illegally. But the conditions are also different in that the population is different. Most of the Iraqis who go into Lebanon are young men, young single men who are looking for work, who probably transited through Syria, were not able to find any work to sustain themselves and their families, and therefore headed to Lebanon to try to make do there. In Lebanon, it is possible for Iraqis to work. Many of them work in the black market, but also it is possible to work legally if you get a Lebanese employer to sponsor you. Unfortunately, the costs of sponsoring Iraqi refugees or any other migrant for that matter are very high, and it's very difficult for Lebanese employers to do it. So throughout the Middle East, what we are looking at is a population of Iraqis who's fairly well educated and has very developed skills, but is unable to work legally, and that is a huge problem. They are unable to sustain themselves pretty much everywhere. In Lebanon, however, the issues are slightly different, as I mentioned, because they also run the risk of being arrested and detained just for being there illegally, and that is, of course, a huge concern to us.
Now, you mentioned that most of, or a good number of refugees in Lebanon were sort of young men looking for work. Is there a common profile of an Iraqi refugee? Are they generally more middle class, poor? Is there sort of a common background between them among the refugees?
It's at this point I would say no. The only thing I can say is that at the beginning of the war from 2003 to 2006, perhaps the people who were fleeing in general were more of a middle class population. These were people who had more resources and chose to go to Syria and Jordan to sort of flee generalized violence. But since the sectarian violence erupted and since really chaos fell upon Iraq in February 2006, anybody who could afford to would try to flee Iraq. And so what we are looking at is people, yes, who are middle class, but other people who basically sold everything they own to be able to afford the trip and to be able to get into into Syria or Lebanon or Jordan. In Lebanon in particular, because of the fact that most Iraqis were not able to enter legally, many had to pay smugglers from Syria to get them into Iraq, and that was into Lebanon. I'm sorry, and that was an extra cost, of course. So what we are looking at right now is a population that is in general very vulnerable, because even those who were middle class don't have those resources anymore. They haven't been able to work in years. They have had to pay for rent, etc. So even they are extremely vulnerable right now.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the sort of United States has not been particularly generous in terms of opening its doors to Iraqi refugees. Do you know sort of how many refugees to date have been granted asylum in the United States?
Yeah, I can tell you the numbers of refugees who have been resettled to the U.S. In 2006, the U.S. resettled 200 Iraqi refugees. There was an outcry amongst the advocacy community, civil society, etc. And in 2007, the U.S. vowed to resettle 7,000 Iraqi refugees. They were only able to resettle about 1,600 in 2007. In 2008, they vowed to resettle 12,000, and I'm glad that they reached this goal. Actually, the goal was reached and increased. They welcomed more than 13,000 Iraqis in 2008, and for 2009.
So you're saying that in 2008 the United States has welcomed 13,000 Iraqis?
Yes. And in 2009, it is aiming to resettle 17,000 Iraqi refugees. So it's good. The numbers are improving, and the U.S. is clearly contemplating the fact that it's going to have to increase the resettlement of these communities. But 12 or 17,000 is still a very small number compared to what the needs are in the region.
And do you know sort of how this resettlement to the United States works? Are they assigned sort of states or places to live?
Yes, basically the way it works is that a lot of Iraqis are resettled in areas where there's an existing sort of Iraqi community, where there are resettlement agencies that are able to take care of them, and NGOs provide assistance to people upon arrival, and people have about 6 months to find employment in the U.S. There's a variety of different criteria that is used to basically facilitate or evaluate their integration within the U.S. They're receiving also English classes. But assistance to refugees in general is very limited in the United States. I think they get a one-time payment of about $425 per person. And with that, they have to pay rent, and they have to pay for everything. And then they have to find work. And for many people who don't necessarily speak English, or who have been traumatized by the war, this is a big challenge, of course. But refugees are willing to face up to this challenge. All they want is a help and a chance to rebuild their lives anywhere they can.
And do you know where in the United States are these pockets of sort of an existing Iraqi community?
I think there are existing Iraqi communities in many areas, but I believe the largest one is in Detroit, in Michigan.
What about other countries? Have other countries been particularly generous? Are there any sort of good examples that stand out?
I think until this year, Sweden had taken much more Iraqis than the U.S. Most of those were asylum seekers, people who actually made their way to Sweden and asked for asylum there. But Sweden had an acceptance rate that was extremely high. The situation has unfortunately changed, and Sweden is now encouraging people to return to Iraq, which, according to us, is a big mistake. But with respect to resettlement in general, most countries have been very disappointing. And I believe that today the U.S. is a country that is willing to take the most Iraqis, outside, of course, of the region, which has shouldered the largest burden.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that countries, the international community has done quite little to support Syria and Jordan and Lebanon in taking care of the refugees. How would that support sort of be manifested? Or what can the international community, what can the United States do to support Syria if it so chooses?
I think the response has to be comprehensive because the problem is extremely complex. There are many things that need to be done. The first thing is, of course, assistance to the refugees and to the host country. So yes, the United Nations appeals are very important, and it's important to fund them, and the U.S. has increased its funding, and we salute that. But so is assistance to the governments of host countries that, as I mentioned earlier, are bearing a very large burden. It is very difficult right now for the U.S. to provide bilateral assistance to Syria because of the tense relationship, but it should be providing bilateral assistance to other countries, and should certainly encourage other members of the international community to assist Syria. Another thing that needs to be done is acknowledge the situation, acknowledge the fact that it's not going to go away in a minute, acknowledge the suffering of millions of Iraqis, and acknowledge the fact that they will not be able to return to Iraq until conditions are met. So talk to the Iraqi government, work with the Iraqi government to first of all halt those enticements to return, but also work on establishing conditions for return, work on establishing security conditions, but also programs to assist people who will choose to return, and program to deal with the property and other conflicts that will certainly arise upon people's return. And finally, I would say that it is extremely important not only to assist countries of asylum and not only to increase resettlement numbers, but also to engage politically with them on this particular issue. It's very important to treat this problem as a regional problem, to engage the Arab countries on this, to engage the Arab League on this, and to realize that this is not only a humanitarian crisis, this is very much a security and stability one. We are dealing with the Middle East, one of the most volatile regions in the world, where many armed groups and many non-state actors are operating. It is a really very high risk to leave millions of vulnerable civilians without assistance in a region where other people might be likely to assist them in the future in exchange for allegiance. So it is in the U.S.'s interest to react to this crisis.
I guess that sort of opens up a whole new can of worms that a refugee population might be susceptible to recruitment from extremist elements. Is there sort of evidence that have refugee populations been more or less likely to join radical movements than other populations?
No, they're not more likely to join than other populations. But what you are looking at in general is that large displacement crises are a factor of instability, that's for sure. Large movements of populations can cause instability in regions of the world, or particularly in already unstable regions of the world. But we also need to acknowledge is that poverty and hopelessness in general do drive people to join the ranks of groups that are willing to provide for them. When the states when the governments are not willing to. This is the Middle East. This is a country that's been dealing with the Palestinian refugee crisis for the past 60 years. And now it has to handle a whole other crisis. If there's anything we should learn from the Palestinian refugee crisis, is that to leave a population with no social, political rights for 60 years, or to leave it unassisted, completely hopeless for 60 years, does lead to security problems. And that's something we would like to avoid with the Iraqi population.
I guess so. So between now and say 20 years from now, what needs to be done to offer what I think you called a durable solution to this crisis?
Well, I've mentioned what I think should be done now to tackle this situation. I think we need to assist the countries, assist the refugees, work with the government of Iraq, facilitate returns when time comes, establish good conditions for return, establish lasting security, lasting peace, but also mechanisms for people to be able to reintegrate when they return, engage the region politically, and then deal with the groups that will not be able to return and that will need to be either resettled in Western countries and provided with a whole new life, or help to integrate locally, including work permits. But of course, right now you cannot talk about work permits in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon because they are looking at millions of people. They are looking at their own populations that is highly unemployed. And they are also looking at the very large populations of Palestinian refugees they've been hosting for 60 years who still have not found durable solutions, and the international community seems to have given up on them. So before we really start talking about integration of Iraqis in the Middle East, we need to start looking at the Palestinian situation as well, because one will not be solved without the other.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Kristele. This was a really, I think, an important conversation. Again, this is not a subject, unfortunately, that gets a lot of coverage, but it is one that, even after American troops have withdrawn from Iraq, if that's to happen, this crisis will persist. And so I'm sure, and I'm glad I'm able to talk to you about this, and it's definitely something that I'd like to keep up with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for having me.
Great. Thank you.